Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Armstrong, and I'm making a series of short videos as part of the publication of my new book, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Neurodivergent Brain. This is a completely revised and updated second edition of a book that I wrote back in 2010. The title of this video is A Brief History of the Neurodiversity Movement. Here's a timeline that gives some of the key points along the development of neurodiversity. The first events really came before the term itself was coined, but has to do with having its roots in the disability rights movement. And that perhaps started in 1962 when Ed Roberts, pictured here, wheelchair bound, wanted to matriculate at the University of California, Berkeley. And he wanted accommodations and classroom setup that allowed him to do his learning. And the administration at first firmly resisted this, and he had to actually advocate quite firmly in order to basically integrate into UC Berkeley. It makes one think about the integration of blacks in the schools in the South. The disability rights movement, in many ways, was parallel to the civil rights movement in the United States. Eventually, Ed was joined by several other wheelchair-bound individuals who called themselves the Rolling Quads, and their efforts resulted in the Center for Independent Living, which is really the first disability rights organization in the United States. In the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a similar movement in disability rights that related to the self-advocacy movement for people with intellectual disabilities. This is a movement that had its origins in Sweden, then came to Canada, and eventually the United States, where individuals with intellectual disabilities and other developmental disabilities could take a role, could have voice in determining how their futures were decided. Also in the 1980s, the deaf community joined in with their feeling that they ought to be considered as a cultural minority in and of themselves, and not primarily in terms of people who could not hear. They honored deaf culture. And as a part of their civil rights actions, they advocated for a deaf president at Gallaudet University, or Gallaudet College, which is an all-deaf university. So that was another important movement that led to neurodiversity, because many people in the deaf community were saying we're fine as we are, we have our own culture, we don't even necessarily want to be cured, to have a cochlear implant or anything that would allow us to hear. So it was reminiscent of the overtones that later came into play in the neurodiversity movement. In the 1990s, the neurodiversity movement really began to take wing, so to speak. Most people associate the origins of the neurodiversity movement with the autistic rights movement, and in particular to a speech that was given by Jim Sinclair at a international conference on autism in Toronto in 1993. He didn't use the term neurodiversity, but he said, you know, parents think that having a child with autism is a great trauma because they were expecting a normal child. But we aren't normal, and yet we are who we are. So don't mourn for us. This was a very strong statement that really began the growth of a number of smaller organizations and chat rooms and social networks, that the internet, which came into play at the same time, seemed to facilitate. The thing about the internet is that it allowed for communication without all of the interference of the nonverbal aspects that people on the spectrum often had difficulty with. So they could communicate more clearly and quickly. And so the neurodiversity movement spread even before the term was used. The actual coining of the term has been attributed to Judy Singer, an Australian advocate for autism rights. She first explored it in her master's thesis, the birth of community amongst people on the autistic spectrum, and then later on incorporated that material into an article that was in a journal on, that was in a book on disability discourse. The actual publication of the word neurodiversity is attributed to Harvey Bloom, a New York journalist who wrote a very brief article for the Atlantic Journal, or the Atlantic used to be the Atlantic Monthly, and this was in 1998. So we can really position the birth of the neurodiversity movement per se in 1998. And from that point, it began to gather steam. As I say, in the 2000s, neurodiversity begins to gather steam. Neurodiversity.com was established, and this was my entree into the neurodiversity movement. I was just cruising on the internet when I ran into this site. I was unfamiliar with the term. This was back in about 2008 or so, and this website and webpage really blew my mind. I recognized some of the figures, people like Andy Warhol and Glenn Gould, but what really blew my mind was the caption below the pictures, honoring the variety of human wiring. I had been thinking about this process for many years. I'd been working in the field of multiple intelligences, Howard Gardner's theory, which also talks about different kinds of brains. And so I was primed to look at this movement as an incredible possibility with amazing potential to change people's minds about people that we've been typically describing as in terms of their negatives. Instead, we can now begin to look at their positives, at their abilities. I should also say that during the 1990s, Autistic Pride Day began to incorporate neurodiversity into its celebrations. And I think now there is this Neurodiversity Day itself. In the 2010s, neurodiversity really started to come into its own. William and Mary University in Maryland became the first university to have a neurodiversity initiative, to set up a program, a student help program based on neurodiversity, so that instead of just having a place where you could have your learning disabilities remediated, it became a center where one could embrace one's neurodiversity and get help with apps and tutoring and other accommodations. And they even hired John Robeson, a person on the spectrum, to be head of their neurodiversity program. And he's done a lot of writing and speaking and advocating in his role. Another thing that happened during this time in the 2010s was the publication of Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity by Steve Silberman. And this book, I feel, did more than anything to put neurodiversity on the map. It was a New York Times bestseller, and in the UK it won the Samuel Johnson Prize, which is a prize for the best nonfiction book of the year. And sadly, Steve Silberman passed away just a few months ago. But he really was a wonderful, warm, generous man who went around the world after the publication of the book to promote neurodiversity and disability rights. And um, he had as an help in the publication of his book a foreword by Oliver Sacks. And I like to think of the neurologist Oliver Sacks as kind of a godfather of neurodiversity. He's known for many books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and An Anthropologist on Mars, where he featured Temple Grandin, among other people. And so just before he died, he was able to write this foreword on for Steve's book. And as I say, this book has had a tremendous impact on the neurodiversity movement. Finally, in the 2020s, where we are now, neurodiversity seems to have come of age. There are many journals now being written and planned that focus on research in neurodiversity, and many articles, thousands of articles now, and hundreds of books. I've noticed even many children's literature books coming out to teach little kids about neurodiversity, which is great to see. Neurodiversity as a term seems to have become mainstream. And I've seen this process happen over a period of the almost 20 years that I've been following the neurodiversity movement. At first it was, what is this term? Explain it to me. And now it crops up everywhere. During Christmas, I was visiting my family, and my niece, who is a junior high student, I mentioned I was working on a book on neurodiversity, and she says, "Oh yeah, we're talking about that in our class." And so this has really come of age and into its own, and it's amazing how rapidly the movement has grown in just these past 25 years. And we can see a lot of future growth in the movement as we move into the future. So anyway, that's a little bit about my book. I have a extended history of the neurodiversity movement in the book. I mentioned some of the main things in this presentation, but there are other things that are important too that happened along the way. At any rate, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you will get the power of neurodiversity and share it with your friends and your relatives, your teachers, your therapists, and so on, your employers or employees. If you're interested in receiving my blog posts, if you sign up on my homepage or on my blog page, either one, you can receive a 200-item neurodiversity strengths checklist, which is taken from my book. And my website is located at institute4learning.com. That is institute4learning.com. Again, thanks so much for listening and for watching. And wherever you are, I wish you health and wealth and celebration of our intrinsic diversities. Thank you so much.